Lemire awakened late, unsure if it was the tedium of spaceflight or because they had stationed a Ubartian in the adjacent quarters, and their well-known sleepy demeanor was affecting him, even without him actively probing. This was unusual, but not unheard of among his people, and it often occurred only with very strong inputs and very talented telepathic envoys, such as himself. The journey had also been very uninteresting. With such a small crew of such domestic variety, there was little fascinating to encounter. There was a Bolan crew member, but without a mate on board, his testosterone effects were muted and not worth the effort to investigate. Of course, that would change once he arrived at his assignment on the numbered 8 station. He reread the paperwork for the 1000th time, going over the specifics of the new species he was to assess. Primate, bipedal, with great visual acuity and a bisected prefocal auditory structure that enhances directional perception of sound. It was almost as if someone had combined the best characteristics of all known animals into a single being. But there, flipping to the conclusion of the paper under mental capabilities, the brief remarks hinted at why they had brought him in for the consultation. A huge prefrontal cortex, bisected hemispheres, various unnamed structures, and just the sheer size of it. In one more day, they'd be there. Lemire felt a wave of tiredness sweep over him, indicating that the Ubartian had returned to its quarters as he fell asleep again. The next day they docked with the station, and Lemire departed, triple-checking his psionic shield device. Having so many people in one place can be disorienting without them. Down the gangplank into the loading docks he was met by his escort, a pair of Carlaxian solidars, and led deeper into the station to the embassy wing, where he would be working for the duration of his assignment. Grayly, as they traveled, he tried to keep himself closed off, but there was a lot going on, and even with his shield up, he caught wisps of input here and there, and when a Zephyr maintenance worker slipped a spanner wrench and struck his hand against the machine, he grabbed his own in pain. Finally arriving at the embassy, he was greeted by the hosts, letting down his shield. He was at ease around political figures, most of whom had significant training to decrease the amount of emotional and sensory output they produced while dealing with my people. This was as peaceful as he could expect outside of the special insulated rooms provided for his people when they visited the station. Or it should have been. The chambers seemed peculiar. Like on his homeworld before a downpour, the air felt thick, which he dismissed as warp lag. But when he was greeted and taken deeper into the embassy toward his meeting, the pressure increased, and the small feathers on his wings seemed electric. Out of prudence, he reactivated his psionic shield, which provided some respite, but he could still feel it there. The door opened, displaying the 2 humans for the first time, and everything began to echo in his thoughts. The bigger one was standing near the door, dressed in a military outfit. As he neared them, he felt his muscles stiffen and his eyes dart about the room, assessing every hazard in an unexpected manner before the sensation faded and the human snapped into focus. Even with his telepathic protection, he was bombarded with vast volumes of information about himself and his bodyguards, including cultural norms. She raised an arm like a wing in greeting, which looked unusual because an appendage is encoded in feathers, then cupping her palms in the standard greeting to his Carlaxian escorts. His archives indicated that the Carlaxians had only made contact with humans approximately 6.5 cycles ago. It seemed strange that this one was so familiar with all of their diverse conventions, making him question who was assessing who. He raised a wing in response, and they both sat down at the table. He dismissed his escorts and they departed, closing the door behind them. The one in uniform remained by the door, still at attention. He lowered his shield to communicate, but was immediately slammed by the pressure again. After wincing in agony for a moment, he felt an intense wave of compassion, as if his own child was being harmed. And when he looked up, he saw the woman with her hand outstretched in a concerned manner. He braced himself for the enormous pressure of reaching out to her consciousness. Touching it felt like being hit by lightning. His pupils dilated and thousands of pictures flashed through his mind. But none of them compared to the terror and pain that racked him like a wave of ruining acid. He saw himself through her eyes, every feather detailed in colors he had never seen before with an impossible amount of vibrancy. The clock on the wall made a ticking noise that told him it was on his left. He hadn't even noticed it was making a noise before, and the smell of her perfume put every scent he had ever smelled to shame and filled his mind in an overwhelming sensation before his vision faded to black. He awoke later, opening his eyes to the dreary gray room. There was a nurse there, but as she spoke to him, she appeared so far away that he could scarcely hear her. There were flowers on the table by the bed, their colors muted and aroma invisible. He wasn't sure what had happened after he passed out. The nurse wiped a small amount of blood from the olfactory slit in his beak. But he was certain of one thing. He needed another hit as soon as possible. It had been 2 days since my first experience with the humans, and despite my best efforts, my hosts had ignored my requests to meet with them again. I attempted to make it appear as if it was not a self-serving request, but rather an envoy doing his best for the Galactic Council. But that was complete bullshit. The time between my first contact and now had dragged on far longer than my entire trip to the station. That woman was all I could think about, and the sensation of heightened senses had rendered the environment dull and bland when I used my own. I even found myself recalling the man in uniform's attentiveness and attention to detail, as well as his predatory instincts and emotions in comparison to the woman's. I replayed the thoughts in my head over and over, but each time they lost some of their resolution. Colors faded, sounds died down, and even the strongest impression of the woman's perfume faded. My mind couldn't keep them all in detail. I was informed that the humans were being held in their quarters as a safety precaution until the council determined how to proceed. I had concealed information about what had transpired, claiming that I had felt poorly prior to the meeting and had simply fainted for unclear reasons. The detainment was only a precaution for the station in case my fainting was caused by a virus or bacteria. To pass the time, I strolled the promenade, not realizing I had left my psychic shield emitter at my apartments. Normally, such an event would have been horrifying, yet hundreds of inputs at once appeared to pale in comparison. I passed the Bolan who had been on the ship I had arrived on. They were sitting with a group of their pals. I approached them, waiting for the empowering sensation of virility that I knew they had to sweep over me. It came and went, leaving me unfulfilled. Why? I questioned myself, which should have nearly overwhelmed me in the past. Had I been wrecked, would I be forced to live in this dull cosmos for the rest of my life? But then, something happened. It was subtle at first, but it pulled me in like a Nuthelin to a flame, leaving an electrifying sensation on the tips of my navigation feathers. I could sense her. It was certainly a girl. The feelings were far too smooth to be male. I almost floated towards the sensation as I moved away from the main promenade. To my left, a Carlaxian slammed its right claw into a shop door, causing him to reel in pain. I felt nothing but a faint tingle in my right wing, but I ignored it and continued to follow the sensation. The intensity increased as I neared housing section. Alpha 4. I presumed here's where they kept the humans. I hadn't been able to figure out where their rooms were from our host, but I knew this was the furthest away from my own quarters they could have possibly accommodated with such short notice. As I approached the corner, I noticed 2 Carlaxian guards standing in front of a nondescript set of quarters. I summoned the thoughts of the human male I had encountered, and in an instant I determined that the best course of action was to try to find an empty quarters nearby and attempt to reach out mentally from there. I had never attempted to make contact from such a distance before, but based on the waves of electric tension pulsing on my feathers, I doubted would be much of an issue. After 3 pretty frantic efforts, one of which resulted in me entering an occupied residence without even recognizing the individuals inside, I discovered an empty room less than 200 meters from the guarded entrance. I went inside, sat on the floor with my back to the wall, closed my eyes, and began reaching out. My first encounter was brief and tumultuous, with my emotions and senses bouncing and echoing between myself and the others as I processed the same data simultaneously. This was different. My own sensations had vanished totally, and I was her. I felt no self in this experience, no identity in this exchange. This time was different. I saw her through her own eyes in the third person, which made no sense, but I didn't mind, because I was in nirvana. Her senses confused me. I imagined she was in her typical living quarters, barely 200 meters away, but the visuals he received were of an unnaturally huge and lush green field. Her vision was of herself from behind, wearing a vivid cobalt blue and teal tunic that matched the vibrant hues he had seen while looking at himself through her eyes during their first encounter. He pressed forward, attempting to catch the whiff of her perfume once more. But as he did, she turned to him, or at least the spot where his consciousness was. At the time, her jade green eyes looked at him with a playful expression as she flared her arms upward, red and yellow feathers sprouting along them as they transformed into the most amazing set of wings, the likes of which would put even the most beautiful girls on his home planet to shame. She bent her wing in the same way she had when they first met, and opened her mouth. Her words had a strange variation to them, like sound coming off water. "Catch me if you can." As she thrust her wings downward and gracefully rose into the air, the grass around her feet swirling in the wake of her takeoff. As his eyesight faded to black, a blaring noise burst into his brain, gradually decreasing in intensity as his own senses took over. The room he was in was filled with a buzzing noise, and when he looked out, he saw red lights spinning in the corridor with the same intermittent buzz sound. He scrambled for his communicator and noticed the time. More than 6 hours had passed in the few seconds he had spent in the human mind. As he peered at the gadget in his wing, many crimson drips of liquid dropped on the screen. He immediately put his wing to his beak, and when he pulled it back, it was coated with a sheen of red, duller than he remembered it ever being, and nowhere near as brilliant as the woman's wings he had just seen. Before he could think about it, his communicator made a bland, soulless sound that scarcely registered. The ID on the call was from the station embassy, and he slid against the wall to the floor as a surge of pain caused his eyes to cross briefly. He flipped open the communications gadget out of habit, rather than a desire to talk right now. The voice on the other end of the call appeared anxious, even though it was still muffled. They indicated that they had been trying to reach him for hours, trying to reach me for hours, that I had been missing, and that the station was under lockdown to find me. "I'm fine," I remarked, suffering with a splitting headache and a desert dry mouth. I fell asleep in the aeroponics bay. I went for a walk, rested beneath the artificial lights, and fell asleep. Sorry for causing a commotion. I'll return now. I flipped the communicators shut before they could react because I was not in the mood to deal with them at the time. Well then, what the hell was that? I had fully lost myself in those few seconds in her mind, wondering how so much time had passed when it seemed so short. It was scary to give up so much control over myself in that way. But I knew it wouldn't be the last time I did so. Not if I got my way. As I strolled to my lodgings, the air over my feathers seemed stale, and the various species on the promenade all appeared uninteresting, like a play you'd seen 1,000 times and knew all the lyrics to, and nothing they did could pique my attention or surprise me. I pitied them. They had no idea what it was like to genuinely live life to the fullest. They were all just living in their tiny lives when there was so much more to see, smell, and feel than any of them could handle. Well, I had witnessed it, and just one idea burned in my mind like the fiery wings on the women. I would have more. I couldn't sleep. It had been nearly 2 days after the incident in the housing block with the woman, and every time I closed my eyes, the blackness loomed over me. I hadn't slept in a long time, and I was having lapses in which I found myself staring at the wall without realizing how long I'd been doing so. It wasn't all bad. The council had allowed me to conduct interviews via view screen. They had been put in both of our quarters, and the humans had been relocated to their regular lodgings in the embassy wing. This was both a blessing and a curse, since I could feel them, but they were still out of reach for me to connect. It was an unfamiliar and frustrating sensation to be continuously reminded of their sensations, but unable to satisfy my want to connect. On the plus side, I was able to communicate with the woman via the system that had been placed safely. We had long talks that were underpinned by the smooth wave of sensations I was experiencing from her at a distance. It was annoying, but better than nothing, like driving toward a destination you can't reach. These conversations taught me a lot about their amazing species and cleared up some misconceptions raised in the initial study. I also discovered that they have both a conscious and an unconscious mind, which explains my weird meeting with her. Apparently, people download vast amounts of sensory data from their first mind to their second mind. Every night when they sleep, they can create customized simulations based on that data to occupy their secondary mind while they sleep. According to her, their experts believe the second mind is far more powerful than the conscious mind. That's right, people have two minds, both capable of melting a telepath's brain like mined slag. While I made progress, it was sluggish, and the council was becoming impatient, as well as cautious due to the incident during our initial contact. And no matter what lie I said to alleviate their concerns, they continued to have my safety in mind. That's ridiculous. I asked the woman if she would let me observe one of her nightmares. It was a little late, but at least I asked this time. She appeared put off by the concept, and even from this considerable distance, I could sense an uncomfortable shift. I panicked, assuming she was aware of my earlier unauthorized entry, and blurted out something I regret to this day. It doesn't have to be you if you're not comfortable. Perhaps your guard wouldn't mind." This was a poor idea, but to my surprise, she stated she would ask him if he was comfortable with it. The call stopped, and I smacked my wing against my own face. What was I thinking asking something like that? I used to have boundaries, but the constant edging of gratification from riding the waves of sensation she was projecting during our interviews was driving me nuts. I scratched the lower section of my wing idly while I reflected on what had happened. Wonderful news. The woman, who I now know as Vivian, said that her guard had agreed to let me observe his dream, and the council had approved, something about the man, who I learned was named Greg, signing an agreement when joining the service the humans call the Marines, that allowed the government to put him in dangerous situations with little repercussion and recourse. This was apparently a common thing in human culture. I tried not to consider the moral ramifications of this because it served my needs at the moment. We set it up. In a controlled setting, on either side of an emitter, using my psychic shield. I was fatigued. I hadn't slept in days, but I tried to mask it to ensure the experiment went as planned. Greg lay on the bed across from me. The shield was to be remained up until he fell asleep. I couldn't get a good sense of his emotions, partly due to the shield and partly because his were always more difficult to read, which is why I usually focused on Vivian when she was around. It felt like hours had passed waiting for Greg to fall asleep, but looking at the clock, it had only been about 15 minutes. The technician dropped the shield and I braced for the hit, but it wasn't as terrible as I had expected, even at this close range. The first image that sprang to mind was Greg, standing alone in a black void, at attention as I was accustomed to seeing him, except he was younger and more muscular. The scenario altered as he put on some unusual combat armor that was brilliantly colored and focused heavily on upper body protection, while providing absolutely no protection to his lower body. He looked to the left and right before yelling, "Blue 52! Blue 52!" Then took a stride onto his rear foot as an odd brown form emerged in his palm out of nowhere. A similarly clothed guy in a different color armor appeared in front of Greg, charging him. Greg twisted as the other human hit him, glancing to one side. Another emerged in front of him, and the other disintegrated into colored mist as it passed him. Greg appeared to be fixated on something in the distance, even as the armored human charged him. In one swift motion, he hurled the brown object ahead, into the darkness, before ducking down as the assailant approached, sending him end over end and toppling over as he erupted upwards. A muffled sound of thousands of voices echoed from the darkness as the vision expanded to show Greg standing in some kind of stadium, surrounded by other humans dressed in identical armor. The vast throng presented itself, with thousands of people up on their feet cheering whatever had just transpired. Several individuals wearing the same color armor as Greg approached him in the same manner as the ones I had just seen. But Greg did not try to avoid them. Instead, allowed himself to be consumed before emerging from the top and being carried by the group on their shoulders. If things had finished there, it would have been a different narrative. But it didn't. The exiles glanced around at the troops, who now stood semi-simultaneously, looking skeptically and critically. The vision twisted abruptly with the same young Greg in a different costume, one that did not make him appear as broad in the shoulders and was altogether different in color, jammed against a wall of dirt with a dozen other people, all carrying weapons. Dull thuds echoed in the distance, accompanied by a slow rhythmic sound reminiscent of heavy wings beating in thick air. The people were hugging the rim of the dirt, shooting their weapons in muffled underwater slow motion. Suddenly something struck me, blood flowing from the wound in my shoulder as I spun to the dirt bank for protection, exactly as I had done in the state championship game years before. Several other humans were also injured. This was it. I was going to die. As I stared in shock, I noticed a small object similar in shape to the brown ball I had just thrown, but much smaller and a dull green color. It flew by and landed just beyond me. Another human noticed it as well and pushed off the bank, sprinting towards the ball. He threw himself onto it as a high-pitched sound overpowered me, as everything washed out to white. This was strange but familiar to me, but something was off. I felt like I was being thrown around and heard voices shouting, but I couldn't see anything. When I opened my eyes, the bright lights of the room had been turned on, and there were people rushing in and out of the room. I was dazed and couldn't get my bearings. I looked over at the small blue and turquoise bird on the opposite table, surrounded by nurses and doctors all frantically working on him, trying to resuscitate. The monitor displayed a flat line, with a steady, monotonous beat. I rolled my shoulder to loosen it up because it had become stiff, and I reached up to feel the scar that ran just inside my hairline on the left side of my head, where they had used a hard metal plate to save my life. I despised the dream, because it constantly reminded me that I was on borrowed time.